The hill is called Cerro de la Muela. It rises above a bend of the Duero River in north-central Spain, a flat-topped mass of rock and scrub, and in the 2nd century BC, it carried a Celtiberian town called Numantia. The town had no marble, no fleet, no treasury worth the name. Its walls enclosed a population that most estimates put in the low thousands. And for the better part of 20 years, that one town on that one hill did something no kingdom in the Mediterranean had managed. It kept beating Rome. In 137 BC, a Roman consul named Gaius Hostilius Mancinus was trapped outside Numantia and surrendered an entire consular army, roughly 20,000 men, to a town whose fighting population may not have reached a fifth of that number. The Senate in Rome was so humiliated that it refused to honor the surrender terms, stripped Mancinus of his command, and sent him back to the Numantines, naked and bound, as a kind of legal refund. The Numantines, with a contempt that must have stung worse than any defeat in the field, declined to accept him. So in 134 BC, Rome stopped sending ordinary consuls and sent the most dangerous man it had, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the general who 12 years earlier had erased Carthage from the map. And here is the strange part, the part this entire episode turns on. When Scipio arrived in Spain and took command of the army camped in front of Numantia, he did not attack the town. Not that week, not that season. His first campaign was aimed at a different enemy entirely, one that was already inside his own palisade. Before Scipio made war on Numantia, he made war on the Roman army. How does a commander win one of the hardest sieges in ancient history while refusing, from the first day to the last, to fight a single pitched battle? And why, more than 2,000 years later, can scholars point to a piece of lead smaller than your thumb and tell you almost exactly when it ended? Keep that piece of lead in mind. We will come back to it. Here is what this episode will walk you through. First, how a town of a few thousand Celtiberians humiliated a string of Roman commanders across 2 decades, and why those failures cut so deep into a culture that thought it had already survived the worst. Second, the condition of the army Scipio inherited in 134 BC and the first orders he gave, orders that by some ancient counts emptied the camp of around 2,000 people, before a single soldier marched anywhere near the enemy. Third, the wall. Roughly 9 kilometers of fortification, 7 separate camps, and a signal system that turned a hill in Spain into the most completely sealed space in the ancient world. Fourth, the river, the one seam in the blockade that no wall could close, and the machine Scipio built to close it anyway. And fifth, the 5 decisions underneath all of it, the operating method that a recent study in the journal Hermes argues won Scipio both Carthage and Numantia, and that professional armies have been rediscovering ever since. One note before we begin. This episode leans on the surviving ancient accounts of the Numantine War and on modern scholarship, including a 2024 article in the journal Hermes on why Scipio Aemilianus won at Carthage and Numantia, and a 2020 scholarly chapter on Scipio and the fall of Numantia in the collection In the Name of Rome. The ancient numbers are ancient numbers. Where they are uncertain, I will say so. To understand what Scipio walked into, you have to understand what Numantia was. The town sat on the Cerro de la Muela near the upper Duero, a natural strongpoint commanding the country around it, the chief settlement of a Celtiberian people called the Aravaci. These were not a rabble. Celtiberian ironwork was good enough that Rome copied their sword. Their warriors fought a fast, ambush-heavy style of war built around the terrain they had grown up in. Broken hills, sudden fog, ground where a marching column could be hit in the flank and cut apart before it deployed. Rome had been fighting in Spain, on and off, since the war against Hannibal, and Spain had a reputation among Roman soldiers that no other province matched. It was the war that did not end. The specific war against Numantia flared in the 140s BC and became a procession of Roman embarrassments. One commander lost thousands of men in ambushes and watched his own elephants panic and trample his lines. Another negotiated a peace, then denied to the Senate's face that he had ever made it, while the Numantine envoys stood there, contradicting him. And then came Mancinus, in 137, with the surrender of an entire army and the spectacle of a Roman consul handed back like a returned parcel. Romans knew how to metabolize defeat. A 2023 study of Roman memory culture, examining how Rome remembered the disasters of the war against Hannibal, shows how carefully the Republic curated its catastrophes, reworking even Cannae into a story of endurance and eventual triumph. But Numantia resisted that treatment because there was no triumph to attach to it. There was only a small town, still standing, and a growing pile of Roman excuses. By the early 130s, the rot had reached the recruiting grounds. Citizens dodged the levy for Spain. Officers found reasons to be elsewhere. The war was unpopular in a way Roman wars rarely were, because there was no plunder in it, only cold, ambushes, and shame. And so the Roman people reached for the one name that carried none of that stain: Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of the Scipio who beat Hannibal, and in his own right the man who had commanded the final destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. He was elected consul for 134 and given Spain. Notably, he was not given a fresh army. He raised a few thousand volunteers, friends, clients, and men who came for his name, and marched to take over the force that was already there. Allied contingents would join him in Spain, including a young Numidian prince named Jugurtha, who arrived with archers, slingers, and a dozen war elephants. Remember Jugurtha's name. This camp is full of men history will hear from again. What Scipio found when he reached the army in front of Numantia was, by the surviving accounts, barely an army at all. The camp had become a town of its own. Traders had moved in to sell to the soldiers. Soothsayers and diviners did steady business with men who were frightened of the hills around them and wanted better news than their officers gave. There were, by some ancient counts, as many as 2,000 prostitutes living inside the camp. Soldiers slept late, bathed warm, and had quietly stopped being dangerous to anyone but themselves. And the crucial thing, the thing Scipio understood at once, is that you could not besiege Numantia with this instrument. A siege is the most patient, most disciplined act in warfare. It is months of digging, watching, and standing post in the cold. An army that had spent years learning to fear the Numantines would crack the first time a sortie came over the ditch at night. So his first orders had nothing to do with the enemy. He expelled the traders, he expelled the soothsayers, every seller of comfortable futures. He expelled the women, the camp emptied by the thousand. He banned beds and made the point personally by sleeping on straw. He cut the menu down to plain food, boiled or roasted, nothing elaborate, and sold off the wagons and most of the pack animals because a mule was carrying something a soldier could carry, and a soldier who does not carry his own load is a passenger. Centuries later, when Romans looked back at the reforms of Gaius Marius that produced the professional legionary marching under his own pack, the tradition remembered that Scipio at Numantia had already forced his soldiers to carry their own equipment as a matter of discipline. Then came the drills, long marches in full kit through the summer heat, entrenchment as a daily rhythm. Dig the camp, raise the palisade, then tear it all down and dig it again until the spade was as familiar as the sword. Men who slouched were punished in front of the ranks. An officer who paraded an ornately decorated shield was asked, in front of everyone, why his shield was finer than his conduct. And through all of it, Scipio refused battle. The Numantines came out and offered it. They jeered from their walls. His own officers, hungry to wash out the shame of Mancinus, pressed him to accept. He would not. His reasoning, as the accounts preserve it, was cold and simple. Desperate men are at their most dangerous in a pitched fight, where despair becomes a weapon. Against desperate men on their own ground, the surer weapons are time and hunger. He would spend the campaigning season making his army worthy of a siege, and then he would conduct one. When he finally moved, it was not against the town, but against its pantry, marching through the lands of neighboring peoples and burning the ripening grain that might otherwise have found its way over the hills to Numantia. Only then, with the harvest ash and the army hard again, did he close on the hill itself. What he built there is the reason this episode exists. Scipio settled his forces around Numantia and began a circumvallation, a continuous fortified ring around the entire town. The scale is worth sitting with. The surviving account gives the circuit of Numantia's own walls at roughly 4.5 kilometers, and Scipio's ring at about twice that, on the order of 9 kilometers of ditch, rampart, and wall, studded with towers at regular intervals of roughly 30 meters. The wall itself is described as around 3 meters high and over 2 meters thick. Anchoring the ring were 7 camps and forts, garrisoned so that every stretch of wall had a reaction force within reach, with one wing under the command of Scipio's own brother. The total force is put at as many as 60,000 men, Romans and allies together, wrapped around a town whose defenders may have numbered a few thousand. And a scholarly chapter on Roman siege warfare makes the broader point that this was the true Roman way in sieges. Not the battering ram or the dramatic assault, but spade work, organization, and logistics. The patient conversion of an engineering problem into a foregone conclusion. Scipio's ring even had a nervous system. Any sector under attack raised a red flag by day or a fire signal by night, and reserves converged on that point along the wall. The Numantines sortied again and again, at odd hours, at weak points. The flag went up, the wall held. No sortie ever broke the ring. But there was one seam no rampart could close, the Duero. The river ran past the town, too broad and too fast at that point to bridge or dam, and the Numantines were using it. Swimmers went out at night. Small boats ran supplies in when the winds served. Divers slipped under the surface and passed the Roman pickets in the dark. As long as the river flowed, Numantia had a thread to the outside world. Scipio's answer was one of the more sinister pieces of improvisation in ancient siegecraft. He built a tower on each bank where the river entered his lines, and between them he moored long timbers on cables laid across the current. Into those timbers, his engineers fixed blades and spearheads, and the current itself kept the whole apparatus turning, constantly, day and night. A swimmer could not pass over it, under it, or through it. The accounts describe it plainly, and you can feel the point of it. This was not just a barrier. It was a message, visible from the town walls, that the last door was shut. From that moment, the siege became arithmetic, and the Numantines knew it. Their most famous answer to it is a story the ancient account preserves in detail. A Numantine noble named Rectogenes, with 5 companions, crossed the ditch on a still night, went up and over the Roman wall with a folding ladder, killed the sentries in their path, and got clean away into Celtiberia to raise help. Town after town turned him down. Rome's shadow was too long. At one town, Lutea, the young men were willing and moved to join him. The town's elders, terrified of the consequences, sent word to Scipio. What followed shows exactly what the rebuilt Roman army could now do, and exactly what its commander was. Scipio covered the distance to Lutea by forced march at a speed no one thought possible, surrounded the town before the plot could ripen, and demanded the 400 young men who had sided with Numantia. The account records that he had their hands cut off and was back in his lines before the siege had time to notice he was gone. No help ever came to Numantia. After Lutea, no one was going to offer any. Inside the ring, the winter of 134 into 133 BC did the work Scipio had assigned to it. The grain ran out. The animals ran out. The accounts describe the defenders boiling leather, and then they describe something darker, the turn to the dead, and then to the weak. The point at which a siege stops being a military event and becomes something there is no clean word for. An embassy came out under a leader named Avarice to ask for terms worth having, arguing that Numantia had fought for its women and children and deserved an honorable settlement. Scipio's answer was surrender, complete and unconditional. When the envoys carried that answer back, their own people, half mad with hunger and suspicion, killed them as traitors. It went on a while longer. Then, in the summer of 133 BC, the year the Roman record marks as the end of the Numantine War, the town gave up. Many of the defenders killed themselves rather than walk out. Those who did walk out, the account says, came through the gates so starved and so changed that the Romans watching fell silent. Scipio chose 50 of them for his triumph in Rome. The rest were sold. Then he razed Numantia to the ground and divided its territory among its neighbors. The town that had beaten Rome for 20 years fell without a Roman soldier ever storming its wall. So step back from the hill and ask what actually won this, because it was not a battle. There was no battle. Strip the campaign down and you find 5 decisions, and they are the reason this siege gets studied instead of merely remembered. Decision 1. He rebuilt the instrument before he used it. Every commander before Scipio had taken the army in Spain as they found it and thrown it at the problem, and the problem had thrown it back. Scipio spent an entire campaigning season, with Rome's most humiliating war sitting unresolved in front of him, doing nothing but restoring discipline. And he accepted the political cost of that patience. The 2024 study in Hermes on his victories argues that this is the common thread between Carthage and Numantia. That in both wars, Scipio's decisive act was to re-establish order and method in a demoralized force before seeking any decision against the enemy. The wall at Numantia was only possible because the men who built it had spent months digging practice camps they were ordered to tear down the next morning. Decision 2. He refused the war his enemy was good at. 20 years of Roman disasters in Celtiberia had one shape: a Roman column accepting or blundering into the sudden fight on ground the Numantines chose. Scipio simply declined the premise. Not once in the entire campaign did he give the Numantines the battle they wanted, no matter the jeering from the walls, no matter the pressure from his own officers. It takes a peculiar kind of confidence for the conqueror of Carthage to stand in front of a small hill town and refuse single combat. And it was the correct call every single day of the siege. Decision 3. He made the spade the weapon. 9 kilometers of fortification, 7 camps, towers every 30 meters. A signal system that moved reserves faster than any sortie could exploit a gap. This is war as engineering, and it is worth noticing that it worked against Numantia at odds that look absurd on paper. Tens of thousands of besiegers against a town of thousands, precisely because Scipio treated those odds as something to be banked, not spent. The ring meant the numbers could never be ambushed away in the hills, which is exactly what had happened to every predecessor who marched those numbers around loose. Decision 4. He closed every seam, and he made the closure visible. The river machine on the Duero mattered twice over. It ended the resupply, and it told every defender looking down from the wall that the world outside was gone. The forced march to Lutea belongs in the same category. The blockade was not only physical, it was a demonstration, repeated until believed, that nothing was coming. Not food, not allies, not luck. Decision 5. He spent time instead of men. From the closing of the ring to the surrender was somewhere around a year, and depending on how you count the start of the blockade, the strangling itself took well under that. Set the cost of that year against the cost of the alternative. Mancinus lost an army of roughly 20,000 in a single campaign and won nothing. Scipio's losses in the entire siege were, by ancient standards, close to negligible, and he ended a 20-year war permanently. Time was the cheapest weapon on that hill, and he was the first Roman commander in 2 decades willing to pay in that currency. Now, that piece of lead. Among the objects recovered from Numantia is a sling bullet, a small cast lead projectile of the kind both side slingers loosed by the thousand, and this one is recorded in the Supplementum Epigraphicum Graecum, a scholarly corpus of ancient inscriptions dated to 134 or 133 BC. Think about what that means. The literary account of this siege was written generations after the fact, and historians rightly handle its numbers with tongs. But out of the dirt of the Cerro de la Muela comes a fingernail of lead that lands exactly on the 2 years the sources give for Scipio's siege. The ground agrees with the story, and the ground has more to say than that. The traces of the Roman siege works, the camps ringing the hill, have been identified and mapped around the site, so that you can stand today where the ring stood and see how completely the noose fit the neck. There is one more thing to take from that camp, and it may be the largest thing in this story. Consider who was in it. Jugurtha of Numidia, learning at first hand how Roman armies work, knowledge he would later use in a war against Rome that made his name infamous. And among the young Romans serving under Scipio at Numantia, the tradition places Gaius Marius, the man who would go on to remake the legions into a professional force, whose soldiers, marching under their own packs, were nicknamed Marius's mules. The discipline Scipio imposed in that camp, the soldier who carries his own equipment, the army as a machine that is maintained before it is used, did not stay in Spain. It walked out of that siege inside the men who watched it work, and some historians trace a straight line from the camp at Numantia to the professional Roman army that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. Scipio went to Spain to take one small town. What he actually built on that hill was a rehearsal for the legions to come. That is the part worth carrying out of this episode. Numantia was not won in the summer of 133 when the gates opened. It was won a year earlier, in the first weeks, when a general looked at the most humiliating war Rome had, turned his back on the enemy, and started expelling merchants from his own camp. Every commander before him had asked how to beat Numantia. Scipio asked a different question first. What is this army, right now, actually capable of? The honest answer was, nothing. So he built one that was capable of everything the plan required. And then the plan was almost boring. A wall, a river machine, a signal flag, and patience. The most feared town in Spain was defeated by a man who never gave it a battle to win. If this is the kind of military history you want more of, the quiet decisions underneath the famous outcomes, subscribe to the War Room Files and leave a like so more people find these stories. I will see you at the next battlefield.